Thanks everyone for tuning in here today. My name is Zach Groff, as you may already know from the Symposium's website. I'm going to talk a little bit about the concept and dynamics of carrying capacity in suburban ecological communities today. But before we get started, I'd like to thank Dr. Hayes and all of those involved with coordinating the symposium. And I'd also like to thank my advisor, Dr. Richard Clark from the Earth Sciences Department at Millersville University for introducing me to this symposium. Carrying capacity is the ability of an ecosystem to support biodiversity. And biodiversity is something that we generally understand as a combination of two factors. One of those is species richness, which is the sheer number of different species in an ecosystem. The other one is species abundance, which is the number of individuals, in other words, the population of each species. And these factors play into species resilience, which in other words is the ability of species populations to recover from adverse environmental effects. Carrying capacity can be affected by both abiotic and biotic factors adversely. And today we're mostly going to focus on biotic factors, but as an example, ecosystem acidity, which is most often caused by acid rain, is an abiotic factor that can affect the carrying capacity of certain woodland songbirds like this wood thrush. Wood thrushes dwell on the forest floor and they rely on the presence of invertebrate species that are only present if there's a high level of calcium in the soils. If you have a lot of acid rain, which causes ecosystem acidity, those species will be less abundant, and so wood thrushes will suffer as a result, especially during the breeding season where they need to acquire a lot of calcium in order to rear their young. On the other hand, white-tailed deer, when they overpopulate, often overbrowse, and this is a good example of a biotic factor, which we're going to get into a little bit more here. In this figure, we can examine the dynamics of population and carrying capacity. Population is represented by this solid line, and carrying capacity is represented theoretically by this dotted line. In keeping with the white-tailed deer example, as their population increases, once they exceed their carrying capacity, in an ideal world their population would decrease, and carrying capacity will then have a chance to recover. When carrying capacity is met, or that white-tailed deer populations are at their carrying capacity, they will live in a forest that looks something like this, where you have a clearly defined mid-story, a canopy, and a forest floor. However, they can supplement their diet as well, especially in suburban ecological communities. When that occurs, they often degrade their natural habitats to something that looks more like this, where there's almost no defined mid-story, and the forest floor is often devoid of diverse vegetation. The other thing that can occur is that they tend not to prefer to eat non-native plants, and so sometimes you'll have a situation in which non-native plants or invasive plants will start to proliferate because they tend not to eat those. And so you end up with, instead of no mid-story and understory, you have a very dense mid-story that's populated with mostly invasive species. The idea here is that the native vegetation is removed from this particular ecosystem and is replaced with non-native, but in this case invasive vegetation. Now, the same thing occurs in suburban ecological communities. We see here that we've removed the understory from this particular place. We've planted it with grass, and we have left a few sparsely located trees. A forest invaded by bush honeysuckle, which is what you see here in dark green, has a dense mid-story that outcompetes tree saplings and other understory perennials. And it can also result in a thinning of the canopy over time, because every time one of these large healthy trees dies off, that space is quickly filled in by the invasive species. Similar thing occurs in something like a park or in a suburban community where you have a heavily compacted lawn that is densely populated with hybrid grasses. The result is the same. You have minimal diversity, and an understory in this case is a monoculture of grass. You can't talk about suburban ecology without talking about the problems with lawns. In Pennsylvania alone, we maintain approximately 1.4 million acres of home lawns. If you lump in our general use of turf grass in place of native vegetation and look at the national picture, this explodes into about 40 million acres. Just to put that in perspective, that's about 18 times the size of Yellowstone National Park, or about the size of all of New England. Lawns are way less efficient at absorbing rainwater, and not to mention the millions of tons of pesticides and millions of gallons of gas that we use to mow, trim, and maintain our lawns annually. This all plays into the idea of the urban-rural gradient, which is the notion that species diversity, in this instance species richness, starts to drop off sharply the closer you get to an urban center. And that has a lot to do with the fact that we remove native species, replace it with lawns, and plant other types of non-native ornamentals. So why does this matter? Well, this causes local extinctions and a loss of diversity at an alarming rate. The key takeaway here is that when we develop suburban areas, we remove the native vegetation and we tend to replace it with alien non-native species. It's important to note, however, that alien or non-native plants are not always invasive. For example, here we have a park setting where crepe myrtle trees are lining this trail. Now, crepe myrtle trees are not known to be invasive, even though they're a non-native plant. However, if you remove the natural native vegetation and replace it with hybrid turf grasses and non-native crepe myrtle trees, the effect could be much the same because they've developed on a completely different evolutionary history. On the other hand, some of these plants do escape cultivation and become invasive, like this Japanese burning bush. Now, invasive plants are alien plants that overwhelmingly crowd out and displace our native vegetation. At least 5,000 alien plant species have been introduced to the United States. Many of those have been introduced as ornamentals, and a great number of our invasive species originated from ornamental plants that we meant to keep in our yards. These plants have not only invaded our suburban woodlots, private property in rural lands, and in our yards, but they've also invaded a great number of our natural areas. A good example of this is here in Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area, where you have cow parsley, a known noxious invasive weed that has invaded what would have been a native plant, perhaps wildflower meadow underneath this power line, and completely displaced the native vegetation. Because of this, we can't just rely on our natural areas any longer to be the sole place where we try to preserve these types of ecosystems. Something that we have to come to terms with is that migratory birds will often eat the berries of invasive plants like burning bush when they need to, but they definitely don't utilize them very often during their critical nesting periods. But given that this is the case, why is it that we need to emphasize restoration of native plants to those ecosystems? What do they do? What purpose do they serve? Well, insect herbivores are the basis of energy transfer into higher trophic levels. This is specifically the case for nesting birds, and most insect herbivores are specialists, like these sawfly larvae. This particular species specializes on white pine trees, so if you remove the white pine trees, you will not find this particular species of sawfly larvae, and so you will be eliminating a food source that is critical to nesting birds. As alien and invasive plants replace natives, insect herbivore diversity will also decline. So even though the birds at certain times of year will be able to eat the berries from this bush honeysuckle, the insects cannot develop on them, and so they lose a food source that they rely on during their nesting season. Moreover, lepidopteran species, in other words caterpillars, in their larval stage are perhaps even more critical than things like sawflies for nesting songbirds. So what can you and I do about this situation? Well, first of all, we need to adopt a zero tolerance policy for invasive species. And the simplest way to do that is to not plant them. And that may seem a little bit of an oversimplification, but the fact of the matter is burning bush, princess tree, and butterfly bush are the names of a few ornamental species that are known to be highly invasive. The more difficult thing is to actually go through and look and see if you have invasive plants on your property and then remove them. The other thing we can do is reduce the amount of lawn we have. Now you may not be able to do this in your front yard, but if you have a backyard, you might be able to do it there. If you can reduce the amount of lawn that you have by 50%, this will go a long way towards restoring the carrying capacity of our yards. We also need to limit the use of alien or non-native plant species that we use as ornamentals. We need to do this to a ratio of about 10% alien or non-native to 90% native. What this means is we need to plant mostly native plants, but there's also some room for compromise. So you can go ahead and plant your crepe myrtle tree, which has very showy flowers, and you can surround it with native perennials, and you'll get to enjoy the best of both worlds. We also need to continue to plant for pollinating insects. We know this to be the case nowadays. These groups of insects suffer more than perhaps many of the other species that we talked about here today. And then go ahead and take a walk in your gardens. Take a walk in your woods if you have them there, and take a walk in your meadows and enjoy the things that you planted, but also keep an eye out for invasive species that try to make a comeback, because they most certainly will. And then voila, you'll get to enjoy these beautiful visitors, things that you've probably never seen before. These pictures here are taken in my own milkweed patch mostly, and here you have the iconic monarch caterpillar, but also the lesser known milkweed tussock moth larvae. But the important thing to note here is that both of these need to develop on milkweed, and they can't develop anywhere else. So if you don't have a milkweed patch, you will not see insects like this. And then we also get to enjoy their adult forms as well when we see monarch butterflies flying around collecting nectar from our flowers. But milkweed also produces showy flowers, and those provide valuable nectar to both butterflies and then pollen and nectar for bees. Now that we know what to do, we have to ask what kinds of things should we plant? Well, when we're planting for pollinators, we have to first understand what pollinators are. Most pollinators, true pollinators, are bees. That doesn't mean that butterflies shouldn't be welcomed as well. It's just that butterflies do a lot less pollination than bees. Moreover, about 69 species of bees are also pollination specialists. That means that they will collect the pollen from specific species and avoid others. So the easiest way to narrow down the search is to plant for the specialists, and then the generalist pollinators will come to your flowers as well. That means a few species are the ones that you would want to focus on, including native sunflowers of Helianthus, asters, goldenrods, and rudbeckia, which we know as black-eyed Susans, but this is a huge group of flowers that you can plant in all different types of situations, and they have many different ornamental features to use. Now, we can't just think about native perennial species when we start planting native plants. We also have to think about native shrubs and native trees. Now, these take up more space, so if you have the option to plant just one woody species in your yard, let it be an oak tree. And here's why. Here is a chart that ranks woody plant groups by the number of butterfly and moth species they support. And oaks clearly support more species than any other woody plant. This oak group, is very versatile. They have members adapted to a wide variety of soil and climatic conditions, and there's also a number of great ornamental features that you can choose from to find the best tree for the place that you're putting it in. Moreover, the acorns also provide a very important food source for certain mammals, including deer and squirrels, and also larger birds like blue jays. But more importantly, the caterpillars of one oak tree can sustain many birds during one single breeding season, and that's really the important takeaway here. Once we figure out which native species we want to plant, we have to figure out where to get them. So I've compiled here a short list of some of the local native plant nurseries in our area here in Pennsylvania, but there are many more in the state. You can get some of them here in a directory compiled by the Pennsylvania Native Plant Society, but this will also point you to sources that are out of state that may have certain plants that others don't, and they can actually ship them directly to you in some cases. But the important thing is, it's not always as simple as going to your local nursery. While it is the case that they will have some, they may not have as wide a selection or the expertise to give you specific recommendations. But at your discretion, you could use many different sources to locate certain common native plants that will improve the habitat in your yard. There are a number of great reference books out there that you can use to figure out what to put in the place of the invasive plants that you've removed, or if you're thinking of just doing some general plantings in your flower beds, this book by Donald J. Leopold is an excellent reference to see the ornamental features of many of our great native plant species. I also highly urge folks to read these two books by Dr. Douglas Tallamy out of the University of Delaware. In this particular presentation, I have referred heavily to Nature's Best Hope, which is a newer work that refers to the latest scientific literature. However, the foundations for much of what he wrote in Nature's Best Hope was laid out very thoroughly in this book from about 10 years ago called Bringing Nature Home. My purpose in giving this presentation here today is to empower you to hopefully begin to adopt a personal land ethic. The more we can do this, the more we can begin to approach the ideals of the human condition that were realized by some of the great conservation leaders. And then we can truly begin to realize that a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community, and it is wrong when it tends to do otherwise. In short, a land ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land community to plain member and citizen of it. Right here in Pennsylvania, we have some great public services available to us. One of them is at the Pennsylvania Game Commission, which I've put some information about right here. But we can also go on to the DCNR website where they have a ton of literature about what types of native plants to put and where to put them. And you can also email me directly, and I'd be more than happy to engage with any one of you in discussion about this, even if you have the vaguest of interest. Thank you all very much for partaking in this discussion here today.